Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And we come to you every other week outside of the legislative session. During the legislative session, it is every week with the latest on state policy developments, on analysis and research, and the news that you need to know about how the state will govern the way you educate your children, the way that you do your business, and how much taxes you're going to pay. So it's news that's relevant to you, and we thank you for joining us. With me here is our Vice President for Research, Todd Myers. He is going to be our guest for today. I want to remind you, if you have questions for him at any time, just put it in the Q&A box right there at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, the Q&A box, because it's for various reasons that you don't need to know. Technically, it's just more difficult for me to get to that other chat box, so it's hard for me to see. Anyway, and as the moderator, if you want me to take that question, I need to be able to see it. Also, if you're wondering why I have the Grizzly Adams beard, it is heading toward December, and I'm going to pretend to be Santa Claus for my kids. So, thus I'm saving the $5 for the fake beard, I guess, on that score. So all those questions answered. Now let's get to the meat of the issue, which was this is the week.
We've already covered the important issues.
That's right.
So, yeah.
The key things. It's the week of Thanksgiving, the time for people to be thankful. And in Washington State, there's a lot of people who are, say, less than thankful, based on the direction they see the state going, the frustration they feel about ever increasing costs of doing business, of living in the state, and the indifference that seems to take place in Olympia about how difficult it is for businesses to compete, not just within the state, but even globally. So with that, Todd, I noted that you have been adamant that there are reasons to be hopeful. And I thought, I've never known pessimism and being mired in defeatism to actually achieve any kind of positive result. So I thought it would be a great thing today to focus on why should we be hopeful as Washingtonians that there could be a change in direction.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. The first is that, having worked in public policy for decades, I've seen things change, right? We've seen things go from very bad to very good in politics and in public policy very quickly. But before we even get there, I think that it's always important to count our blessings and to be thankful for where we live. We do have problems in this state. We're going in the wrong direction. We chronicle that all the time. But I think we are blessed to live in the United States. And we should, at Thanksgiving, and really, more than just at Thanksgiving, remember that and be thankful for that. One of my favorite videos is a video of Yakov Smirnoff, who's the Russian comedian. Yeah. It's very funny. And he talks about when he left the Soviet Union and that their family was in New York, and that on their Thanksgiving, they just sort of stopped and took a moment to recognize how thankful they were to be here. I don't think we always appreciate how fortunate we are to be in this country. And as many challenges as we have, it is still the greatest country. And we are celebrating our 250th year next year. And that's truly remarkable. So I think you always have to start with that basic recognition that we're fortunate to be here.
Start with the macro view. In fact, our series on American by Choice, the video series that we had with immigrants from Washington State who talked about, when they came here, what they did, what they accomplished, how happy they were to be here. I mean, there was a lot of different messages. One of them was, saying, is there racism here? Sure. But you ought to see it everywhere else, you know. And they pointed out, these are people who risked all kinds of things to get here and sacrifice to get here. And as you've pointed out, our worst critics want to stay, with a few exceptions. Sometimes they'll buy a home in like Ireland, and then they keep their other homes here because they want to come back after the statement is made or whatever. But really they want to stay here. And it's an odd thing that with all the focus that some have on this country of oppression and systemic racism and all these other things, that the system itself is a system that so benefits people that individuals from almost every nation around the globe try to get here legally and illegally. Just to have that opportunity.
Well, in that video series, there was two of my favorite moments. One where a woman from Vietnam
Yeah.
who was very poor, moved to the United States, and now has started multiple businesses
Yeah.
and been successful. And I got to know her because government was harassing her and making her life difficult. And one of the favorite things, she and I were having coffee one time, and one of the favorite things she said to me that my wife and I still say occasionally to each other is that she was just talking about all the challenges, and she sort of paused and she said, government makes everything sad. And I just thought that was very funny. So, but in that video series, I asked her, I was like, what's your favorite thing about the United States? And then I said, what's your least favorite thing? And she paused and she goes, nothing, nothing. And I thought that that was really telling. And then another one of the interviews we did was a gentleman from India. And I said, isn't it hard? Right? You grew up in India. This is your country. This is your friends, your family, your culture, all these things. To come to another country and to choose to become a citizen. Like, isn't that difficult? He said, what you don't understand, Todd, is everybody wants to be a citizen of the United States. And so I just, that sort of thing makes me realize that we don't often appreciate what we have. And it's why in that series we chose to work with immigrants, because I think sometimes they have an appreciation for what we have. We focus on the problems, understandably, but they focus on the good things we have because they didn't have them. And so that, I think, I just want to start with that we need to be thankful. Doesn't mean that we don't fight, that we don't work to change, that we don't, like, all the things that we do every day at the Policy Center are focused on making things better, but we should take that moment to appreciate it.
For Washington State, oh, and I should mention, you can watch the video series American by Choice on our YouTube channel at Washington Policy, or you can make it easy on yourself. Go to washingtonpolicy.org, click on any blog, and at the bottom of the blog, you'll see all the links to our social media pages, and you can watch it there as well. Speaking of Washington State specifically, though, I mean, setting aside, there might be some viewers who say, look, yeah, of course, there's a reason to be proud to be an American. There's all kinds of opportunity, but everyone's leaving for opportunity. There's no hope of change here. One of the things that was mentioned at the Eastern Washington annual dinner, and it's the cover story of the upcoming edition of Washington Policy Center magazine, is the Power of 10. And you mentioned it with John Bernard, who is he was the individual who he's our senior research fellow for government accountability. He set up the Results Washington program, which, before you say, wait a second, he set up Inslee's Results Washington. How dare he? Well, this is the guy who set it up so that they could measure the success or failure of their results, and then based on the results of policy, change it so that they would know which direction, which policies were working and not working, and then apply that. And he was the critic when they stopped doing that and erased it. He was like, "What is going on here?"
Yeah, it was such a good tool for accountability that Jay Inslee killed it because he didn't want accountability.
That's right. Yeah, and this was the governor who promised, "Hey, I'm different. I'm all about metrics and accountability and science." And then when the science was applied, it was like, "I got to get out of here." But when he was on stage with you at the Eastern Washington annual policy dinner in Spokane, he said when he was launching the new America's Pulse application, where this is a new kind of tool for making governments accountable nationwide, where you can compare across 50 metrics, every state. It's America's Pulse. You can read about it on our webpage at washingtonpolicy.org or in the upcoming magazine if you're a member. He said, how many people does it take to get you to look again at a policy, get you to look at this app? If people contacted you, how many would it take? And his answer was 10.
Yeah.
I thought that was a powerful statement, because most people will say it's hopeless. There's trying to get so many people, trying to get X many thousands. What's going to happen? But when it came to just, it's not a guarantee of results that you want, but it's a guarantee of a start.
Right. And of attention.
Right.
So when I worked at the Department of Natural Resources, we would get 10, 15 emails or letters on an issue, and people would want to have a meeting about it. And I would say, it's 15 people in the entire state. But that's how little it takes to get the attention of people in state agencies and politicians. They do pay attention. Now, as you say, they don't always, flip 180 degrees because that, but they do respond. And often what happens is that, if the policy was going to be here, When people pressure them, it moves,
Right.
right? It can be a little bit better, a little more flexible. So every little bit helps. I mean, I think a lot of times people feel like they're screaming into the void. And that's not true, right? That does get attention. And, one of the things about politicians is that they have very thin skins often. And so if they feel like people are criticizing them, they will respond. So don't give up. Don't feel like your one voice doesn't matter. It absolutely can. And I've seen it.
Well, let me double up on that because when I worked in the media, we had a similar phenomenon where somebody would send an email of criticism or a claim about a host to management. And it only took a few of those when the management would perk up and go, well, and all of a sudden they're having a meeting about, hey, this is the criticism of you, or
Yeah.
hey, you're getting high praise over here because of this. And it was important to them.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's shocking how few people will actually take the time to do a quick note or and I'm not saying all notes are equal. If you're just writing a letter saying, F-bomb this,
Yes.
that's not going to be
No,
taken seriously.
no profanity.
Right. Skip the profanity and just focus on, you know what? For example, in this news report, you missed this aspect, which I think affected your story. And that kind of criticism is absorbed and they take and I'm not saying they change like say 100%, but it is something they notice and they'll apply it and it might change the needle a little bit later on, which is important.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the only thing here too. We look at the election results of this past election. There's a lot of people who stay home. I mean, well, I say stay home. We're in a mail-in state. It is, it's about as easy as one could possibly make it without holding your hand and circling and coloring the circles, for you. And there's still, a huge number of people who don't bother to vote.
39%.
Yeah.
So the statewide turnout was 39%.
Wow.
Which means that if you vote, you essentially are voting for two people.
Yeah.
Because only less than half of the total number of people vote. So again, you can make a big difference. And we often see races that are, decided by very small margins. But the other thing that we see is that in terms of convincing people and talking to people, people will sometimes process, right? They're not political experts. They're trying to live their life, right? They're trying to make sure that their family gets fed, that their kids get to school, that they do the things they want to do. And so trying to persuade them is very hard because they don't have the attention and they have to think about it. But here's where it makes a difference. When you make arguments, people will process them. And then when there is a moment for them to act on it, that's when it becomes meaningful. And so, for instance, in this last election, in Olympia, of all places, they had an initiative on the ballot, city initiative, to increase the minimum wage, among other things. And it failed.
Yeah.
In Olympia. So how does that happen? The reason that happens is because people make arguments that say, look, if you increase the minimum wage, it increases the cost of hiring somebody. So you're going to hire fewer people. And who are the people who are going to get left behind? The people who have the least skills, the people who most need the experience to get into the workforce. That's the only way that they're going to climb up the rungs, is to get that experience, to get that knowledge, to make themselves more valuable. And by, having a minimum wage, you lock those people out of the system. And in Olympia, Washington, of all places that you would not expect that to resonate, it did. And they started to realize we're shooting ourselves in the foot. This is driving up prices. This is not giving the jobs and the opportunity that we want. And so they voted it down. So it feels like a very long fight. It feels like, each little incremental gain doesn't matter. But something as dramatic as that example, I think, shows that those arguments over time, when there is a moment when people have to come to sort of reckon with, okay, what decision are we making? That's when it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I've told the story of John Quincy Adams many times. I really respect that, the former president becomes congressman. He keeps bringing forward these petitions from slaves, and the Congress has the gag rule, but he keeps fighting against the gag rule, using this as a fight against the First Amendment, and in favor of the First Amendment because the gag rule was he thought unconstitutional, and he just kept going. And they said, "Why do you keep doing this? You're an old man. You fail year after year." And he said, "The duty is ours. The results are God's." And I love the fact that ultimately he dies on the floor of the chambers of the House, and there's that chair that's still there that he died on. And then Abraham Lincoln, one-termer congressman, is one of the pallbearers that hauls him off. And there's nothing written about it. There's no proof that Lincoln was impacted, but I cannot imagine that one-term congressman was not impacted by the the persistence and the fortitude of the man whose body he carried.
Yeah.
And so you never know what your legacy is going to be. And I think if more people approached the fight as far as, look, there's big stakes and it's important and I understand how you can get emotional and sometimes you got to take a step back. But if you look at it like, this is something that I need to do and I need to keep going, and you just don't accept defeat. It's like defeat is not part of it. It's not a competition. It's the job that you do. I think that helps. Because I've felt it too. I've been on the radio for almost 15 years. A lot of frustration, a lot of there's a lot of challenges there, and I know people are trying to live their lives. But every once in a while you get that win, and it's all the sweeter. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And the thing is we see them all the time. So people were asking us, earlier this year, okay, give some examples, like, are you having success? Is the policy center focusing in the right places? And this is something that, as vice president for research, I think about all the time. Are we focusing on the right issues? Are we using the right tactics? It's why I do this. And so we put together a list of wins that we've had this year,
Yeah.
even in a very difficult climate, for our ideas, for liberty-based, freedom-based, free market-based ideas. Even in this sort of climate, there are wins that we can point to. One of the issues that I worked on is we did a big study on the $45 million electric vehicle subsidy from last year and showed that it didn't have an impact, right? That it had very tiny impact, that even if you assume that their numbers about CO2 are correct, it reduced $45 million reduced Washington State's CO2 emissions by 0.03% for 1 year.
Yeah.
So that's how little. So we put this out there, and there was supposed to be $62 million in the current budget for that same program. It's not there. Now, the majority party, when they wrote the budget, they didn't say, hey, guess what? We're killing that program,
No.
right? They just quietly kept it out, because they realized that compared to other things, it wasn't a priority, it wasn't working. So oftentimes the victories don't occur, there's no parade, but they are there. And so that, I think, is just one small example of how that can happen, even in a frustrating environment like this.
I like the fact that we dodged the bullet on the extension of bonds,
Yeah.
to 70-year bonds.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about not your children paying off your bills, but your children, your grandchildren and great-grandchildren
Yeah.
are going to end up paying on these projects that they have no say over, that are the opportunity cost of which are going to prevent them from being able to improve
Right. Yeah. So let me
transportation.
explain what happens. So Sound Transit,
Yeah.
right? They have all sorts of financial problems, cost overruns, constant cost overruns. They want to do all these projects that are, very expensive. So they wanted to make their finances look better. So they, in the transportation budget, were trying to get the statutory limit on bonding from, I think, 30 years or 20 or 30 years, I think it was, to 75 years. Now, what that would do is that it would reduce the costs in the near term, but it would massively increase the costs over time.
Right.
So you would end up paying, and we're run the numbers, and there's a lot of estimates, so there's a lot of assumptions that you make about how much they would bond and all sorts of things, but it's billions of extra dollars.
The assumption with Sound Transit should be as much as,
Yeah.
it's like how much wood would a woodchuck chuck? As much wood as a woodchuck
Yeah.
could chuck.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen with Sound Transit.
So in the most extreme scenario, literally tens of billions of dollars that would have been paid extra for no additional transportation benefit, for nothing, just so that they could make their books look better. And that's another example of a policy that we stopped because we raised the red flag. Charles Prestrud, who's our transportation director, noticed it, alerted people to it, and got that removed. So, I mean, those are two big ways that, are not, that people don't notice, because what they do notice, understandably, are the largest tax increase in state history, a massive increase in the state budget and spending, the fact that we, even with all of that, we still have a deficit next, right? All of those things are get the headlines for really good reasons. But there's still progress that we make to stop some really bad ideas.
We got a question from Richard. He wants to know, has anyone ever studied why people don't vote? It's a good question.
Yes, I mean, there's been lots of studies. There's all sorts of reasons. I think, people had a theory that it was, well, we need to make voting easier, which is why we need to go to vote by mail. As I said, turnout was 39%. So there's some marginal improvement by making it easier. It used to be that you had to put a stamp on it. Now you don't even have to put a stamp on it, and it still hasn't had much impact. People don't know their issues. People don't know much about their city. These were off-year elections, and so it's primarily local, city, things like that. People pay a lot of attention to the mayor of Seattle, but if you ask people to name who the mayor of their town is, many can't. So they feel like they're not qualified, or they don't know, and they don't want to make a bad decision. I would encourage people, just, take the time. Sit down with the voter's pamphlet. I mean, the voter's pamphlet is really a pretty good guide. And over time, you start to learn, sort of how to discern, oh, okay, I get how, the words that people use and who's endorsing this person and who's endorsing that person. So don't feel intimidated by those local races. You can figure it out. And, the marginal difference between a good vote and no vote is really pretty small. So I would encourage people to engage. I mean, having worked in this a long time, there are some races, judicial races and other things like that, where I'm not an expert, but I can tell you that when I see the Trial Lawyers Association endorse a judge, I generally vote against that person. So, I mean, there are some good sort of rules of thumb that you can use. So I think that's one that I hear all the time is that it's like, well, I don't know the people, I don't know the issues. It doesn't take long to look at it and make a pretty good guess about who's more like you are.
Yeah. And that's what I did. If I'm unclear, you read that voter's guide and you see a lot of endorsements coming in, you can make some pretty basic assumptions about the direction they want to take policy to go.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have that endorsement.
Yeah.
So next up, you have a Seattle Times piece coming out
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
Yep.
And it's regarding a letter that Bill Gates wrote. Bill Gates is, he's always in the news around here, but he's an international figure here, and he's been very focused on his philanthropic activities, and he's upset about the fact that so much climate policy isn't working.
Right.
Kind of a refreshing take for once.
Yeah. So he has a web page called Bill Gates Notes, and on that, so we just finished what's called COP30, which is the 30th International Climate Conference, and it was in Brazil. And so in advance of that, he wrote this note about how our climate policy and climate approach to climate change has been failing. And he made two basic points. Most people have focused on the first point. And the first point is that climate change is not an existential crisis. It is not the catastrophe that people have said, and quit saying that it's a catastrophe, quit doing this because, one, it's unscientific, and two, it turns people off, and it's not effective. So that's the thing that everybody focused on. The Seattle Times had an op-ed criticizing him for what they call downplaying it, which I think is ironic because I don't think anybody has spent more of their own money on trying to find climate solutions than Bill Gates. But that's what everybody has fought about. And the reason people like to fight about climate science is that not because people are scientists. The editorial board of the Seattle Times or other places, they're not scientists. So how do they choose the science they like? Well, the ones that fits what their ideology is, the one that makes them feel like, that agrees with them. So that's why people like to fight about the science, not because they're expert, but because it reflects, it's an ideology, it's an identity thing. But I think the more interesting part was the second part of his note, where he talked about the things that we are doing aren't working. this is something that we've been talking about in Washington State forever. As much as we talk about how we are leaders, how we are effective, we're doing all these great things for climate change. The fact is that CO2 emissions go up every year. And based on preliminary data between 2012 and 2023, CO2 emissions went up in Washington State every single year except 2020. And we constantly pat ourselves on the back about how great we're doing. And this is exactly what Bill Gates was looking at is, are the things that we're doing working? And one of the points that he makes in there that I think is too often forgotten is that we have a limited amount of resources, that there are trade-offs. And if we waste money on things that don't work, it takes away money from things that could. That opportunity cost is ignored so often by politicians. And that's not just bad. That's not just waste. That's not just bad for the taxpayers. It's not just bad for the economy to take taxpayer money and waste it. It's bad for the environment because there are things we want to do that can make a difference in the environment. And if we don't have the money for that and we instead spend it on something that doesn't work, we've wasted that opportunity.
Yeah, it's bad for the environment and the people that are paying the bill. I mean, when you think about people struggling, yet they care, you see this at schools all the time. People are trying to recycle, they're trying to do the right thing. And then, as you point out in the report card for Washington's Future, available on our webpage at washingtonpolicy.org, you look at, we're paying 141 times what private programs are paying for carbon emission reductions.
Right.
And 141 times the opportunity cost of that money. I mean, you look around, we've got these culverts that were court ordered to fix that we don't have the money for because they were taking it from, they're stealing it from the transportation fund to put it in there. We have roads and bridges that are in decline, sharp decline, and they're getting, the more we kick off the repair or replacement, the more expensive it's getting. We have all kinds of problems with that in foster care system, and our Medicaid reimbursements in Washington State are pathetically low, and causing problems for doctors and hospitals and healthcare providers. That's a government issue, not, a lot of people want to pass the buck to the federal government. That's a state government problem.
Right.
We have all these issues with money, and yet we're not careful with it. So to me, part of the thing I really like about Washington Policy Center is these are issues that they don't have to have an R or a D next to the name. And anybody could look at that and they should be able to champion a change of policy, either because they want more efficiency or because they want better results or both.
Right.
There's no reason it has to be a partisan thing, even though lately, if you criticize a policy, people immediately kind of get their back up and say, you know what, but there's somebody on my side, that has that policy, therefore it must be good. We need to be able to take a look at things and see that they're, if they're failing, we need to change them. So my one question for Gates would be, how come it's taken you so long to ask this question? Historically, I think his organization is philanthropic foundation was very big on metrics, and I don't understand why this is kind of a new thing for him. I mean, I'm glad he's there. I'm not trying to throw him under the bus on
I don't
that
know the answer to that question. I think that he would say that he's been focused on this and that, we are more and more off track, or I don't know what he was saying.
It'd be fine.
But I think that, what we see here in Washington State is that we get sold policies to say, oh, we're spending this money to reduce CO2 emissions. And then when the policy comes in, we say, well, that isn't working. And they say, oh, well, that's not for that. Right. And so I frequently, write about these issues, and I get criticized by the Department of Ecology. And I happen to look at a disclosure request and some emails from the Department of Ecology where they're talking to each other about our criticism. And one of the things they say is, but what Todd doesn't understand is that this spending is not designed to reduce CO2 emissions. It's designed to do other things. No, I understand that that's now what the rationalization was. That wasn't what the rationalization was when it was sold. You see this all over. The same thing is true in Portland, Oregon. Portland put on the ballot creation of what they call their clean energy fund. And it was sold as the creation of more clean energy. That's why it was called the Clean Energy Fund. And then when it was put into practice, the money was not going to produce clean energy or reduce CO2 emissions. So I pointed this out. To their credit, Portland Oregonian reporter asked the Sierra Club, who was the supporter of that program, and said, this is not working, right? Why isn't this supporting clean energy? And they said, oh, that was never the goal. The goal was about environmental justice. Well, then why is it called the Clean Energy Fund if it's not about clean energy? So that I think is, you can make an argument that says the spending is not about reducing CO2 emissions. The cap on the state has a cap on CO2 emissions. That's what's going to do the job. That's a fine argument, something I've pointed out. But again, that's not what we get told. What we get told is that we have to have this money to meet our climate goals. Okay, we're not meeting our climate goals. So why don't you spend the money to help meet the climate goals? And then they say, well, but that's not what the money's for.
Or return the money. You could have a neutral.
Yes.
You could have the cap with a neutral revenue.
And that's the other part I think about this is that even if you, I mean, like what I get when I do these sorts of things, I guarantee that there's somebody will send me an email that says, Todd, why are you even talking about this? Climate change isn't real, or it's not a risk, or the risk is low, or things like that. Fine. Like people can disagree about that. But even if you, one of the things I tell people is that the more concerned you are about climate change, the more upset you should be about these failures.
Exactly.
Because if you do think that Bill Gates is wrong and that climate change is an existential crisis, the fact that our CO2 emissions have gone up every year except the COVID year over the last 10 years should make you lose your mind. And that's not, in fact, what I see from the environmental community or the politicians who say those sorts of things, which indicates that maybe they don't actually believe it either. But if they do, they're the ones who say, you know what? Doing more of the same is not going to help. We need to find new ways. That, I think, is the message that we need to remind people is that on issues where we do agree that they're serious, and like as I write in my book about ocean plastic, I don't think there's anybody who says, I don't really care about plastic going into the ocean, right? It's something that everybody agrees. The United Nations has been working on an ocean plastic treaty forever. What are the chances the United Nations efforts are going to work? Zero, because the countries where the ocean plastic comes from don't have good governance. So what's the only solution? The only solution are market-based solutions. And that's where you see organizations who collect, recycle, and then repurpose plastic. So, if you go to the store, you buy Windex, it has a little thing that says made with ocean-bound plastic from plastic that would have gone into the ocean. That's a market force. And so even where people say, I mean, I think too often, again, the environmental fight is about people who say this is a very serious issue, or they say this is not an issue. But what we should say is, okay, you're right. I am concerned about ocean plastic, or I am concerned about other issues. You're still wrong because government solutions don't work and market solutions work better.
Yeah, and we need to get better at holding them accountable. Like with the media, you think of former Governor Inslee. We have across the board, he dumps the accountability metrics. Then when he realizes the metrics show that his policies aren't working, he doesn't focus on trying to change them so that they do work or finding ways to get the results that he wants or be more efficient. He just erases them. And then he still gets identified as the climate governor, and then Time Magazine this year, after all of this is well documented, a total failure. He gets, what was it, the Earth Award from Time Magazine. And you think as long as that should really upset people who take the climate issue seriously on the left. They should be looking at that saying, no, wait a second. If nothing's happening here and there's a negative, why is this person getting the Earth Champion Award? Why aren't we focusing on what actually works?
And when he got that was what, I mean, among other things, sent me over the edge. And I said, well, so I wrote a piece that got published nationally in The Hill, laying out the fact that Jay Inslee was failed at his own most important agenda to try to provide some accountability.
Right. And that's his metric. I mean, it's not even Washington Policy Center metrics. It's the state metrics that he created in order to hold himself accountable. And sadly, so far our state seems to be hell-bent on continuing that path. I have hope that some change, some necessity, sometimes creates virtues in people, and there's some new financial realities that are coming on board that might get people to take a second look on the other, at these policies, even if they on both sides of the aisle, there's one side, obviously the Republicans are going to be critical, but I think the Democrat leadership might start getting more interested in these kinds of arguments too, because of the financial realities of the state. Well, we're in Thanksgiving week. We mentioned why we should be thankful, and I just want to close by saying I'm thankful to work with you and with the team here at Washington Policy Center. I worked in the radio for about 16 years. I relied on Washington Policy Center for local news and perspective and analysis that I literally looked and couldn't find it anywhere else. And this was an essential institution, so I've always been very proud to work here. And with Todd, I think he's a great resource. You should, if you haven't picked up his books, they're great, super informative, and look forward to the next year.
Yeah, and I think we should say that we're thankful for our supporters. We couldn't do this without you. And one of the things that I hear all the time is frustration. People say, Washington's in a bad position. I don't know that we can turn it around. I can tell you that that's simply not true. Early in my political career, in 1992, Democrats won everything. This is back when I was working at the Republican Party. In 1992, Democrats, Mike Lowry, and they had this, they raised taxes, the largest tax increase in state history at that time. And 2 years later, in 1994, Republicans took control of the House and Senate. And if you couldn't believe this, 7 of the 9 congressional seats were Republicans. Now, that just shows how much change can occur. Washington Policy Center is nonpartisan, and so we look for friends wherever we can find them. And one of the things that I'm gratified by is that we do have people on both sides of the aisle work with us. Representative Reeves last year, who's the chair, Democrat chair of a committee, invited Pam Lewison, our agriculture director, and and gave us a full hour to talk about our ideas. And I really appreciate doing that and that opportunity. And they listened to us sincerely, and we have continued to work with them. We work with lots of folks. So I don't want my anecdote about working. My past as a Republican hack to indicate to tell the wrong story, because we do really enjoy working with people. And I think that, as the case of Olympia shows, you would not call Olympia a conservative community, and yet they are recognizing that bad policies have consequences. So there are opportunities for change. We are seeing it. It's going to be hard. We've just elected a socialist to Seattle. I just put out a video today about why socialism fails and why it's likely to fail in Seattle. And sometimes, unfortunately, we need to relearn those lessons. But there is opportunities for change.
If the Chinese Communist Party can see the benefit of free market reforms, it's possible for Seattle to think, you know what, maybe we need to reapproach these issues and save our money for our other priorities over here. That would be something. I'm going to drop this too. I did that Ancestry.com thing a long time ago. So I am a descendant of William Bradford. So I'm basically, you're in the presence of Thanksgiving royalty here. So I'm pilgriming up.
Well, I'm a descendant of a Salem witch, so that says something about me as well.
There we go.
Yeah.
I'll burn you later. We missed Halloween. We should have gotten into that.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much. And by the way, we went from less than 1,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel this year to more than almost 21,000. So there is an explosion of interest. So people are interested. They want to know what's going on. They want to know what's happening. It doesn't, as we pointed out, there's lots of different ways to look at policy that could apply to the left or the right. Pick your lane, but get policy working again in Washington State. Thank you for encouraging your friends to subscribe and like our YouTube channel. That's awesome. My team member, Donald Kimball's just done a great job with that YouTube channel and getting our videos to look professional and thematic and exciting. And it's really working for us. So we appreciate you out there sharing those videos as well. Have a great Thanksgiving with your friends and family. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, I guess. We're Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.